Erev Tov. Good evening, everybody. We're about to begin. I hope that you can see both Ann Stewart, our ASL interpreter, as well as myself. I'm Rabbi Jonah Rank, the president and Rosh Yeshiva, the academic head of Hebrew Seminary Rabbinical School for Deaf and Hearing. I'm very pleased for us to be gathering this evening. I know that folks are muted right now, but if you can give me a thumbs up if you can see both Anne and me. Great. I'm seeing a few thumbs. That's excellent. Uh, I'm even seeing an elbow from Alan. That's very exciting. Very good. Um, I know that it's taking just a few minutes for folks to get in, and I'm uh, looking forward to us studying in just a moment. We'll give just another minute for folks to get on in. We'll get started. Um, it's good to see everybody. Thank you so much, Anne and Rabbi Nesselson. Rabbi Nesselson, by the way, is the chair of the board at Hebrew Seminary, and it's lovely to have some board representation here tonight. And also, I saw Rebecca Schreier. Becca Schreier, also a member of our board, is here this evening, and thank you both so much for being here. And I see Paula and R and Danny Hum and Iris and Elliot, David, Alan, Jan, Susan. It's good to have so many folks joining us this evening in Cass. Um, so thank you all so much for being here. And Elliot Eisenberg, another member of our board, has joined us. It's good to have so many people present and studying together. You have probably all given some thought at this point to the fact that we have elections next week in the United States. We've probably received many phone calls or received many emails or received many text messages or people even knocking on our doors asking us about how and when we're going to vote. These are all important questions, of course. And I'm not particularly interested in talking tonight about specific candidates who are appearing on our ballots, though there may be just a little bit of that. And hopefully it won't devolve into too much of that, of course. But really, what we're navigating are the Jewish values that are going to appear on the ballot. And I want to also just turn your attention to that over here. I put in a URL. So if you want not to follow the slideshow tonight, but you want to pull up your own version of the sources that we'll study tonight, and I'll do my best to guide you through both the slideshow as well as the source sheet. You can type this into your Google Chrome or Firefox or whatever you use to surf the internet. You can go to tinyurl.com/Jew BB, that's for ballot box, 2024. So that's tinyurl.com/Jew BB 2024. Um, and I am excited that we'll get to study some of these important issues. There are far more issues than we can possibly cover. There are far more issues than uh, time will permit for us to discuss, but we will take a look at a few of the critical issues that Jews are facing. And of course, we should begin with the fact that it is a blessing for us to be able to vote in the United States. So much so that in Jewish terms, it's considered a blessing. Over here, you can find in the left-hand side, and if you're looking in that packet, you can find this as source one. I'll always put the source number on these slides, but this is from an Orthodox rabbi who died not too many decades ago, Rabbi Moses Feinstein. who famously wrote a letter, which, even though the year was 1984, this is definitely a typewriter situation. And you can see that he's answering this question that was asked of him of should Jews vote? Which is a funny question to us today, maybe. But I guess in 1984, there was sufficient question over whether this is a Jewish thing to do. Should Jews vote? And he wrote, on reaching the shores of the United States, Jews found a safe haven, and the rights guaranteed by the United States Constitution and the Bill of Rights have allowed us the freedom to practice our religion without interference and to live in this republic in safety. He wasn't the first person to recognize this, of course. But what he did here was a little interesting, because then he goes on to say that a fundamental principle of Judaism is, he says, Hakaras Hatov, in more contemporary Israeli pronunciation, we might say Hakarat Hatov, recognizing that which is good, recognizing benefits afforded us and giving expression to our appreciation. Therefore, it's incumbent upon each Jewish citizen to participate in the democratic system which guards the freedoms we enjoy. You could read the whole letter, of course, on your own time or here, but this is an interesting thing because this is the first time that a Jew argued that Jews have an obligation to vote, that it wasn't just a good thing to do, but that this is actually some sort of obligation. And it's funny too, when we think about the Jewish values of are we obligated to vote? Are we not obligated to vote? He starts with this principle that we're actually obligated to recognize good things in the world, which is a funny debate unto itself, actually, because really is gratitude a mitzvah? Is it a commandment for Jews to actually have gratitude in their lives? I do want to just zoom out for a moment to talk briefly about a word that we're going to use a few times tonight, which is halacha, which you may have heard it used in the sense before of Jewish law. Many people do use that word halacha to mean specifically Jewish law, but halacha is a path, and it's a path of Jewish thinking, and it's a path of Jewish living. And quite frankly, a lot of halachic decisions are sometimes theoretical. We're not going to get into so many theoretical debates here, but there is this sense that halacha is, to whatever extent Jewish law could be a legally binding thing, that it's either really important or it's at least, or maybe it's even mandatory. So I will tell you that it's pretty hard to find a source that says you have to be grateful for all the things in your life. There is a source in the Talmud. This is going back about, this source goes back maybe 1800 years or so, when we don't even know which rabbi said this, but a rabbi said it is forbidden for a human to find benefit in this world without reciting a blessing. Anyone who finds benefit in this world without reciting a blessing has blasphemed God. So, do you have to say thank you to all the people? I mean, I'm not here to tell you that you shouldn't be saying thank you to your fellow humans. I'm just interested in this leap that happens in 1984 when Rabbi Feinstein ruled that yes, Jews should be able to express in their civic duties and as citizens of their country their gratitude for their country. It's not just gratitude to God, but it's also gratitude to humanity, which is a nice shift. It's good to say thank you after all these years. Um, and if you don't believe that just because one Orthodox rabbi said it's a mitzvah, is it really a mitzvah? Uh, we'll take the words of a Reconstructionist rabbi, Rabbi Barbara Penzner, who wrote that the most basic tool of activism is to vote, and I believe it is a mitzvah, a sacred obligation, not only to vote, but also to bring our children to the polls in order to teach this primary building block of democracy. In a country where so many take this right for granted and others neglect it, Reconstructionist Jews should embrace voting as a sacred ritual. This is a rabbi who belongs to a denomination that largely argues that halacha has a vote but not a veto. That if you're going to debate your greatest values, that it's not necessarily about following what is a mitzvah or what's not a mitzvah, but here she's telling us, listen, this is a mitzvah, and we have to take it very seriously. Now, we'll get into some issues, but I want to tell you that there are too many issues for us to discuss. We're not going to get to all the issues that people are voting for on the ballot. And I will tell you um, that this is a bit of an interest of mine, not only as an American who cares about the future of democracy in our country and the future of our leadership, but I also care a lot about taking the time to speak to fellow Americans about how they're going to vote. And without getting into the details of what causes or which candidates I support, uh, I like to speak to folks who live in areas where people really have a great divergence of opinions and a real diversity of opinions. And for me to summarize all the conversations that I've had in, let's say, the last 4 weeks alone would be totally impossible. Americans are concerned about so many things that it's easy to forget are actually on the ballot. Um, Front and center of so many conversations right now is the topic of abortion. And I want to be very clear that I will very rarely tonight tell you that halacha exclusively endorses one idea. In fact, I will frequently tell you that halacha both endorses and opposes one idea. Remember, in American law, there is a law that you do have to follow. But when it comes to Jewish law, the Talmud, many people think of the Talmud as a great book of Jewish law, but it's much better a book of Jewish arguments. And what we have really inherited as a Jewish people is far less a great law system and far more a great debate system. So I am happy to share with you uh, tonight, when it comes to abortions, there are some complications, of course, we'll encounter. But I do want to note that actually some of the best arguments may be just a little bit too graphic for us to get into. But the rabbis, for nearly 2,000 years, have been dealing quite vividly and carefully with that subject of abortion. And what does abortion mean? In short, they've almost consistently ruled in favor of if somebody needs an abortion, they should have an abortion. What that means, though, gets a little bit more complicated of what does it mean for someone to need an abortion. So a still troubling source that we can look at together, but a little less graphic than the one we omitted just now. Um, in the Babylonian Talmud, we have this exchange between two rabbis who love to argue with each other. There's Rav Huna and Rav Chisda. And by the way, when they argue with each other, they're not necessarily having the same conversation. Have you ever had a conversation with someone where you're arguing with them and you slightly change the subject? That's the way it works sometimes in the Talmud, not always intentionally. But Rav Huna begins by speaking of something that is controversial for us to think about regarding a minor who's attempting homicide. It's permitted to save oneself in exchange for the soul of the one attempting homicide. And one who's attempting homicide does not need a warning. There's no difference in applying this principle in the case of an adult or a minor. Now, I'm not sure how I feel when reading that because I don't like to think of children being put on trial even for terrible things that they've done, though, of course, there should be some grounds of consequence. I just have a different relationship than Rav Huna did, evidently, to capital punishment. But Rav Chisda says, once the head of the baby has emerged, so this is obviously a whole new conversation, but Rav Chisda is now talking about birth. Once the head of a baby has emerged, one does not touch the baby harmfully, for we do not set aside one soul for another soul. Rav Chisda says you can't exchange one soul for another. You can't say, this person's got to go because they're trying to get at me. But what if this baby will lead to the death of the mother? Now, that's an interesting question Rav Chisda is asking. This is different because from forces only controllable in the heavens, homicide does threaten her here. So Rav Chisda is actually more responding to Rav Huna that even a baby could be in some way not attempting homicide, but threatening the death of another human being. And that is a case where abortion would be permitted. Now, things are far more complicated because if we imagine halacha, and this is really hard to do because we're talking about an abstract concept, but if we could imagine halacha sitting uh, at their kitchen table filling out their mail-in ballot or going up to the booth and filling out the piece of paper there, how would halacha vote when it comes to abortion? There are many different ways of phrasing this, and we're not going to read the entirety of this now, but I can share with you just this one brief note that was written in December of 2021, which was an inflection point regarding the legality of abortions in our country. And this was, I believe, around the time that the Supreme Court allowed certain bans on abortion to go into effect. I believe in Texas, and then there were a few other states that followed, I believe. But Rabbi Dr. Elliot Dorff and Rabbi Dr. Pamela Barmash, two conservative rabbis, wrote, and it's always fun to just look to the last line. Of course, all the details that are interesting come before that last line, but they say that neither viability nor a woman's right to choose is the basis of Jewish law on abortion. So it's not about women's rights. It's not about the viability of a baby that's going to determine how do Jews vote on abortion or think about abortion. But they say they, as in viability of the baby or a woman's right to choose, do play a role indirectly. What matters in Jewish law is the woman's life and health, both physical and mental, that abortions can become necessary when the life of the pregnant person is endangered. And we don't take mental health for granted when we say that, because mental health, as we have learned, really ties into the actual physiological beings that we are. So there's a complication about that that we should acknowledge, that it's never so straight and easy. I will say that given this kind of thing, Jewish law would have a hard time existing in a society that bans abortions. And it may struggle in a society that bans abortions with certain exceptions. Because what if those exceptions, especially when we talk about mental health, might differ from a civic leader's interpretation of health versus a Jewish interpretation of health? So abortion bans can be very tricky for a halachic mindset. Now, this might not be the number one thing that we think of, uh, whether we're in Illinois or in Massachusetts, but this actually may be a number one issue for many folks. When are welfare programs part of what Jews do? Do Jews really do welfare programs? We're talking about Social Security or we're talking about Medicare. So when does halacha endorse welfare programs? There's a great work, this Guide to Jewish Practice, Community, Gemilut Chesed, and Tikkun Olam, that Rabbi Dr. David Teutsch wrote about a decade and a half ago, where he gives a bit of a history about how in pre-modern Jewish communities, Jews were actually taxed by themselves, that Jewish leaders would tax Jews who lived in their shtetl, let's say, that they were taxed to fund many of the services the Jewish community provided. And very few services like the tamchui, which was the soup kitchen, could be offered to those who weren't residents of that Jewish town. Um, Now we have a different scenario where in our contemporary lives, membership in a Jewish community, whether you belong to a synagogue or a JCC or some other Jewish organization, this is a totally voluntary thing. The obligations of Jewish organizations to unaffiliated Jews and their non-Jewish family members are less clear today. Social welfare organizations can attempt to meet the needs of those who come for help, And congregations very often really limit what kind of services they can offer to their community members. So this creates a new situation where uh, we have to fill in the gap of what were those communal services that the Jewish community offered to the Jewish community. Now, Rabbi Teutsch continues that both biblical and rabbinic thought recognize the obligation of communities to provide food and shelter and clothing and healthcare for their own, as well as to provide for the safety and civil rights of their members. And many contemporary Jewish efforts to define social justice implicitly or explicitly take these ideas about communal obligation and they transfer them to the secular governments. So if the Jewish community is no longer going to provide those kinds of welfare programs and health care, uh, now this is something that's going to have to fall perhaps to the government. We're not going to read the entirety of this piece by Rabbi Teutsch, but again, if you'd like to look in the source sheet that we linked to in the beginning, you can go there and read the fullness of it. Um, Now, I want to tell you again, Judaism is great for debates, not always so great for forming consensus. But you might even be surprised. Why do I write that when halakha opposes welfare programs, we can turn to this section of the Talmud where it says, Shkol Yisrael arivim zeh bazeh, that all of Israel is responsible for one another. Doesn't that sound like we're actually completely responsible? It's because we have to think about, are we responsible for anyone beyond our own people? And that's a great question that the rabbis debated. So I want to share with you a debate about what's the most important thing in the Torah. You've probably heard some version of this debate before, and there's a good chance that maybe you've heard both sides at this point of this debate, but there's a good chance you've heard one answer. So in Sifra, which is an ancient commentary on the book of Leviticus, it tries to make sense of the holiness code, which is this great ethical code that appears towards the middle of the book of Leviticus, which is the middle book of the Torah. And some people would say that when you look at the middle section of the middle chapter of the middle book, then you're looking at the real meat of the sandwich of what is this biblical book. So uh, Sifra begins with this comment about Lo tikom v'lo titor et bnei amecha. Do not avenge and do not hold grudges against the children of your nation. Some rabbi jumps in and says, well, you may avenge and hold grudges against those who worship stars and constellations, not Jewish people, right? Be careful with your nation. Don't be so angry at them. But other people, sure. Now, here's where we get this kind of idea, because the verse even continues with a great law you've heard many times, perhaps, ve'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, you shall love your peer as yourself. And Rabbi Akiva says this is the greatest principle in the Torah. And Ben Azai hears Rabbi Akiva and says, not so fast. He says, this is the book of the generations of humanity, is a greater principle than that. And you might wonder, what's he talking about? So there's an implicit debate that's happening here. Rabbi Akiva, on the one hand, is saying that when it comes to love, we can love all of our peers. And if you're a Jew, your peers are the Jews. And Ben Azai says, when it comes to love, we have to think about our peers in a much broader sense. And if you look back to Genesis chapter 5, this is when there's the first genealogy of the human species. And this is an argument that all humans are created in God's image. Nobody could possibly say, my lineage is somehow greater than yours. So when we have this image of Ben Azai arguing with Rabbi Akiva, there's a great debate over, does welfare Does the concern of the Jewish people really apply beyond the Jewish people, or do we just fight for our own? So this brings us to the question of, well, how would halacha vote on welfare programs? If halacha had to show up to the ballot box today and put in its halachic vote, uh, there are different answers to this, but there is a general sense within the Jewish world that we have to be thoughtful and mindful to protect vulnerable persons. We have to think about people who might not have money coming in. So I'm sharing with you, this is a 19-year-old resolution from a group of conservative rabbis, the Rabbinical Assembly, who uh, resolved that Social Security should not dissolve, that Social Security was an important program for America, for the American government to provide for all those Americans who are protected by Social Security. That sure, there are reasons that we need to rethink how Social Security may be calculated or distributed, but getting rid of it would be a moral problem in Jewish eyes. That was the argument passed by the Rabbinical Assembly, a group of 1,600 rabbis approximately across the globe. You have to wonder how the 200 or so who live outside the United States voted on it. But anyway, it's always interesting to see those sorts of resolutions. And resolutions are, they're not exactly halachic documents, but they're not halachic documents. And Reform rabbis, Reconstructionist rabbis, Orthodox rabbis, rabbis of all denominations and gatherings create resolutions of all sorts. For many Americans, regardless of how close or far they live from any border of the United States, there's a real question about border security right now. And this is informing a lot of voters. Um, I have spoken to voters in Montana who, despite living really close to the Canadian border, are really concerned about the Mexican border. And I'm sure that you can find folks who are concerned about borders uh, nowhere near them throughout the country. And there are various stories that we hear about what's happening at the borders, especially the Mexican border, and people are concerned. Now, it is possible that we can understand halacha as endorsing greater border security. There is a general principle. I find this part of the Talmud both moving and troubling, and then just wacky in its own way, because one of the rabbis in the Talmud, and we don't know which rabbi in the Talmud, but about 1,500 years ago, some rabbi said, the Torah said, if someone comes to kill you, get up and kill them, which is perfectly reasonable. And it's perfectly logical that we would have a religion that endorses self-defense because we believe our lives are valuable, because we believe that our lives are holy. So why would that not be the case? But what's funny about this is that the Torah never says this exactly. And uh, whereas the Talmud often says this is a Jewish value and here's proof that this is a Jewish value, uh, instead, somebody seems to have made up a quote from the Torah and stuck it in the Talmud. Um, I'm not sure it's as hysterical as I think it is, but these are the things that keep me up at night laughing. All right. Still, it's a Jewish value. Source 15, though, this comes from Rashi, uh, great French, German, Jewish commentator on the Torah. He had an interesting uh, read on this verse in Deuteronomy chapter 33, verse 25, which, by the way, if you ever want to read a part of the Torah that makes no sense, you should read Deuteronomy 33. And verse 25 is no exception. There are many words that we don't understand, words that appear only once in the Torah. And many of these verses are written in shorthand in a way that would suggest that maybe it's ancient or maybe it's just poetic. But we still don't really fully understand what's going on, which is why Rashi gets inventive when he reads this verse. There's this weird phrase, Barzel unchoshet min alecha, iron and bronze as your lock. This is part of Moses addressing the tribe of Asher, and he's perhaps saying that there should be some locked boundaries for you guys, and they should be strong as iron and strong as bronze. One of the words that is actually frequently uh, translated as security in that verse, many of the medieval Jewish commentators actually look at that word for security, which is dov echa, and they say, we have no idea what this word means, and don't pretend that you know. But nonetheless, Rashi read this and said, ah, border security. He says, now that man Moses began to speak to all of Israel. They were all heroes, sitting in governed cities and locking them so that enemies would be unable to enter, such that each may be locked with locks of beams made of iron and bronze. What an interesting idea. Rashi wanted the Jewish people, all of the Israelites, to build that wall. Nobody was talking about this, and Rashi lived in France. So he's really using his imagination. Perhaps he felt vulnerable in his French Jewish community, after all. There were all sorts of terrible events happening throughout Jewish history and in this medieval moment. Perhaps he wanted a more secure Jewish community. Now, I want to say that there's no argument in the Jewish tradition that says, don't be safe. But what there is in the Jewish tradition is an argument that we have to be thoughtful about who might be beyond that border and who might have come from across the border. So I'm not going to say that halacha exactly opposes border security, but there are tensions that halacha has with border security. I'm going to tell you too that this is a source that comes at the end of a tale that you may have encountered before. If you've ever heard the story of Tanur Shel Achnai, the oven of Achnai, there's a great debate where one Rabbi Eliezer is arguing against the entirety of the rabbinic tradition, really, over whether or not his position is right in understanding whether an oven is good enough or not good enough for one halachic reason or another. Now, the ending of the story is much less popular than the beginning of the story. If you want to read the ending of the story, I provided in the source packet the ending of the story. It's a tragic ending. And in the end, it seems that Rabbi Eliezer has himself become an outsider among his own people. He's been ostracized, he's been excommunicated, and there are actually all sorts of ways in which there are some gates that are built up and even mentioned in the story. It's an interesting literary read. But what we'll focus on together is this really fascinating segue that happens where the sages taught in a Braita. This is a teaching that never made it into the Mishnah, a book edited about 1800 years ago. The sages taught that one who verbally mistreats the foreigner transgresses three prohibitions, and one who oppresses the stranger transgresses two. You shall not mistreat a foreigner. That's one from the Torah. When a foreigner lives in your land, you shall not mistreat that foreigner. That's another one in Leviticus. And let no human mistreat their colleague. That's another one in Leviticus. And a foreigner is included in the category of amito, of that person's colleague. And you shall not oppress that foreigner. You shall not oppress a foreigner. You shall not become a creditor to that foreigner. There are all sorts of ways in which the Talmud finds the Torah protecting foreigners. And the Talmud continues that the foreigner is treated generally as such throughout Jewish law, as someone to be protected. And a Tana, this is someone who got his words into the Mishnah, taught that Rabbi Eliezer the Great says, for what reason did the Torah warn in 36 different places, and some say in 46 different places, with regard to oppressing a foreigner? Like, why did the Torah warn us so often that we shouldn't oppress the foreigner? On account of wandering being bad for the soul. It's a harsh life to be one who is wandering, one who is lost, one who is unsure of where they truly belong. And we have to be empathetic to that nature that someone might experience. So there's a question of, well, we've heard pro, we've heard con. How would halacha vote on border security? And the answer is long, because you asked a bunch of Jews to try to give an opinion, right? But this comes from a Reform rabbi, Rabbi Jason Rosenberg. Oh, I'm sorry about that. Rabbi Jason Rosenberg gives this uh, uh, sermon that is shared from 11 years ago, where he's talking about his understanding of Judaism and immigration reform and the kinds of empathy that we have to keep in mind when we think about immigration reform, when we think about borders. Um, it's a source you can look at on your own, of course. We're not going to get into it too deeply, but empathy is, of course, the way to go here. Now, for all those who quickly read the screen I accidentally slid to, this is hopefully nobody's heart is racing, but how Trump and Harris stand with Israel. This is an interesting uh, conversation because my own sense has been less that Donald Trump and Kamala Harris, and this is among the few times today when we're actually going to talk about anybody in particular who's on the ballot, but Donald Trump and Kamala Harris, in my own understanding, they actually have quite a lot in common in their own views on Israel and their support for Israel. There is some degree to which we can hear in the tone of what they're saying, or we can see in the shape of what they're saying. We can see little hints of what might be different in their views. And I'd encourage you, I'm not going to get so much into it because it's all really details, but there's a great article that Ron Campais released a few days ago in the Times of Israel that is a pretty good breakdown of Donald Trump and Kamala Harris's differences and similarities on the Middle East policy. A few of the things that are highlighted. Donald Trump speaks frequently of victory for Israel, and Kamala Harris speaks more about getting to a point where all sides can agree to a ceasefire. So those are different language, but they're all effectively wanting an end to the war, right? And they all want hostages to return. There's a lot in which they agree. Uh, One key difference that uh, Ron Campias does mention, which we'll get into a little bit, is that just as a matter of tone, a lot of Donald Trump's support for Israel often comes in assertions about himself, that let's say if he were president on October 7th of last year, that Hamas would have never invaded, because Donald Trump commands a certain amount of respect or perhaps a certain amount of fear in governing in other nations. And there will be times when Donald Trump will call himself the protector of Israel. Um, and that's just a bit of a tone difference also that we might hear when we hear of Kamala Harris and Donald Trump. I'm less familiar with instances where Kamala Harris has spoken so much in the first person about what she will do solo as president, but there is a lot of rhetoric that we do hear from Donald Trump of what he would do solo as president, that he might be a protector for women or for Israel. There's all different ways in which we might hear that. Now, what's interesting to the Jewish community might be less what do the Jews think of, can we trust Kamala Harris or trust Donald Trump with Israel? Because they're really saying quite similar things in my understanding. But the way that Palestinians or the Muslim world or Arabs might think about Donald Trump and Kamala Harris with regards to Palestinians. Now, if you were to spend a little bit of time on Al Jazeera, looking at news that's aimed at Arab world, the Muslim audience, and all sorts of intersections with Palestinian community, you can find this video from Mariam Nemazi, where she talks about Trump versus Harris ending the war on Gaza. And her own conclusion was that neither Donald Trump nor Kamala Harris, despite Kamala Harris talking about dignity for Palestinians and that Palestinians need respect and peace eventually throughout all of this. And Donald Trump doesn't so much talk about Palestinians. Her own conclusion was that neither candidate really is putting what Palestinians want front and center, which is an interesting note. Not something that I've necessarily picked up on, but there's probably some truth to that if that's being made. And I don't know what more to say on that. How does halacha vote when it comes to this war in Gaza is so deeply complicated that we're not going to get into it so much, other than to say that obviously a Jewish state is something that the Jewish people have longed for in many ways. How to get there has often been a disagreement in Jewish history. What's fascinating, of course, is how many Reform Jews, how many Orthodox Jews, and how many conservative Jews prior to 1948 were opposed to the creation of the State of Israel, especially rabbis. Uh, in the Reform world, it may have been because nationalism was a problem. In the Orthodox world, it may have been problematic because the Mashiach, the Messiah, was supposed to lead all the Jews back to the Holy Land. And what right do we have to intervene in history and forego whatever God's hand has planned for us? And this kind of push and pull with, is Zionism good for the Jewish people or not good for the Jewish people? I often think back to where I went to rabbinical school, the Jewish Theological Seminary in 1948. Remember, Israel became a state in May, and graduation was right after uh, Israel had become a state. And there was a push from the students at the Jewish Theological Seminary that they should play Hatikvah, the Jewish national anthem, at the graduation. And the chancellor of the seminary said, absolutely not. We already have an anthem for the Jewish people, and it's Adon Olam, that final prayer that we say at the end of services. And what ended up happening was they did not play Hatikvah at Adon Olam, but they did find a bell ringer at one of the nearby churches to play a melody that sounded just like Hatikvah while graduation was happening. So that way the students could acknowledge and everyone celebrating could acknowledge what a miracle the state of Israel is. We've gone a long way in where is our standard feeling towards the state of Israel. We hope that there will be peace. We want dignity for all. Now, this is a more complicated piece because sometimes what voters are thinking about, and this is the last of the real categories we'll be grappling with tonight, but there's this question of halacha. How does halacha consider dignity in rulership or integrity? Voters are often thinking about what personality do I want for my president? What personality do I want for my senator, for my congressperson, for my mayor, for my governor? These are great questions. And Judaism has plenty to say on the subject, and the source packet has many sources that we're not going to get into. But I will show you briefly this trio of sources that actually, although they're written centuries apart, um, they actually read together rather poetically because, in a way, they are this commentary on what does it mean to live in a world with justice, and what should the attitude of a leader be towards justice. It begins with this question of justice and ends with this comment on those who do or don't want justice or want proper, fair justice in the world. Um, in the second, in about the second century, one of the great rabbinic leaders, Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, said that the world stands on three matters: proper judgment, truth, and peace. That's Din, Emet, and Shalom. For it is said in the name of God in Zechariah 8:16, you shall adjudicate truth, justice, and peace within your gates. God said we should make sure that there is truth, justice, and peace. And some 300 or so years later, the Jerusalem Talmud comes around. There's not just the Babylonian Talmud, there's also one that makes it out of the land of Israel. a little earlier and a lot messier. But someone comes and comments on what Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel taught. And at that second paragraph, you see the three of them, that's judgment, truth, and peace, din, emet, and shalom. The three of them are actually one matter. They're all one idea. When judgment comes to be properly adjudicated, truth comes to be known, and peace comes to be manifest. Now, if that wasn't enough of a pitch for why you should have proper judgment in your world, consider this statement from Devarim Rabbah. Devarim Rabbah is a commentary on the book of Deuteronomy, and the author, we don't know who, but whoever this author was, says, "Give your attention. If you bend justice, you shake up the world. For this, as in justice, is one of the legs of the world." Remember, we said that the world stands on three things. The world has three legs. It's got judgment, truth, and peace. And if you're going to start messing with one of those legs, you're going to start an earthquake, a moral earthquake. And that's intolerable. So we have to be really careful in the way that we treat the legal system, in the ways in which we treat what is justice and what is law. Um, Now, this is something that we should be careful to think about. And we're not going to read the entirety of this now, but I do want to draw your attention to uh, this very powerful piece of the Jerusalem Talmud, the Talmud Yerushalmi, where there's a warning about people who want to take the law into their own hands and forego the idea that other people should collaborate with them. We should always be careful and cautious as a Jewish people when we hear about people who might deem themselves above the law or just as good as the entirety of the law system. And we're not going to read the entirety of this, but there's a whole lot of anxiety about people who want to adjudicate solo. And there's even this argument that the only person or the only entity that should adjudicate the law solo is God. And if you look at the bottom left paragraph where it says Rabbi Yehuda ben Pazi uh, enters, Rabbi Yehuda ben Pazi says, well, actually, even the Holy Blessed One does not adjudicate solo. This is known, for it is said in the name of the prophet Micha in First Kings, and every host of the heavens stood over that divinity, to the right of that divinity or to the left of that divinity. These celestial beings on one side inclined God to judge with a hand towards acquittal, and those celestial beings on the opposite side inclined God to judge with a hand towards prosecution. That God doesn't even judge alone. God calls upon the angels and the heavenly hosts to make legal decisions. So if you ever say, there's only one ruler of this universe and it's God, Rabbi Yehuda ben Pazi says, not so fast. Even God doesn't act alone. And no human should think that they're better than God when it comes to acting alone. So you have to be really careful with where our egos lie. That's something that we're commended to consider. I also want to turn your attention to a really incredible lecture. I've given excerpts of it in the source packet, but it's a really fascinating lecture. Interestingly enough, delivered in New York to a bunch of American conservative rabbis about a very American problem, but the whole thing was delivered in Hebrew. This was Rabbi Morris Adler, who I was reading about and was sad to discover yesterday, which was the anniversary of the Tree of Life shooting. I was sad to learn that Rabbi Morris Adler himself died at the hands of a shooting in his synagogue. This was in 1966, a tragic situation unto itself. But Rabbi Adler was a really brilliant thinker, and he commented on what are the foundations of democracy in the Jewish tradition. These words are offered in 1943, a time when democracy felt like it was under real threat to American Jews who were thinking about what is the situation of the Jews in Europe right now. They're no longer subject to a civil democracy. Now they're subject to real fascism. So Perhaps he didn't want other people to start saying something anti-Semitic. Maybe that's why he delivered this in Hebrew, so that other people wouldn't understand. But he says that our tradition establishes law and specific solid boundaries for governance and authority, and it's long settled that it's prohibited for a leader to transgress any such boundary, that no leader can break the law. There's a classic teaching in the Oral Torah of America, which is a funny way of calling the way that people speak in America, that democratic governance is a system of laws, not men, which is to say, law and not the ruler is the deciding force in society. Um, there's this long-standing understanding that law is to be followed by the leaders. Now, I'm not here to tell you for whom to vote, but I am going to advocate that you vote. And I want you to consider that when you vote, it's going to be a sacred undertaking. When you vote, it's going to be a religious experience. Whether or not it feels religious to you, you are fulfilling a mitzvah. And for us to do Hakarat HaTov, it's good to do a little blessing. In the source packet, there's a whole variety of different blessings that people can recite. Uh, some of them will speak to you or not. Maybe none of them will speak to you. But there are blessings from Rabbi Mordechai Kaplan, the founder of Reconstructionist Judaism in 1951. And there are blessings as new as 2020, and I believe 2024 maybe have made it into the packet too. I'm not looking at it right now. But there are new prayers for voting always being composed. Actually, this one is from 2024, so I stand immediately corrected. Um, there, there's all sorts of ways to meditate on how God and you are connecting, or whatever is divine to you is connecting with you when you vote, if you vote your heart and you vote your conscience. I've been really grateful to study with you all about the Jew at the ballot box, navigating Jewish values in the 2024 US elections. This is, of course, a presentation from Hebrew Seminary where um, my job is not just teaching Torah. My job also includes working with a really wonderful faculty of people who teach important Torah that rabbis need to know and practical rabbinics that rabbis and Jewish leaders need to know in order for there to be a strong and healthy, vibrant future for Jews in the United States and North America for years to come. We are an institution that's been around since 1992, and I really love the students and the graduates and the faculty and the board. It's really a holy community, and I'd encourage you to check out what we do at Hebrew Seminary. We have other upcoming events. We have, of course, classes for folks who are considering a path in Jewish leadership. They can enroll. I'm going to pause from speaking about Hebrew seminary or democracy frontally at this point, and I'm going to offer the opportunity for folks to ask questions or add in comments. So feel free to unmute and or maybe even raise your hand if you know how. Jan, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. I couldn't find the little hand thing here. I now and then I hear people think that the way that they vote, the candidate that they would support, should be considered based on essentially one factor. Is that candidate, name of person, good for Israel? And it's sort of like there's one issue, that's it. It strikes me that that's not really where we are as Jews, that we ought to be considering multiple variables, not just one thing. Any thoughts on that?
Sure. No, thank you, Jay. That's a great question. And you're not the only person I've heard hearing other people say that. And I've certainly heard people say that, their one thing that they have to vote for this year is Israel. Sometimes they hear the one thing they're voting for is abortion. Or, I mean, also when I'm calling Americans I don't know, sometimes I'll hear the one thing they're voting for is Palestine, right? There's all sorts of one issue people when it comes to how they're going to vote. And it's very tricky to be a one issue voter because you have to believe that if it's really coming down to one issue, that somehow if the candidate disagrees with everything else that you would believe, that it's really worth it for that one issue. As you saw, the rabbis can't figure out what is the one most important part of the Torah. As voters, I think we have to be careful in thinking about what's the one most important issue. I would encourage people to think about the complexity of for whom they're voting and for what they're voting. It's never just one thing.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Jan. And Susan, go ahead.
Yeah, I just kind of struggle with what we were talking about. A lot of, some Jews feel that Israel is the most important issue, and we should consider Israel's welfare exclusively, because we're Jews, and Israel is the safe haven for us, or for whatever reason. But then the other side of that is that we're voting in an American election, and we're also Americans. So, and we have to think about the welfare of Americans. Hopefully, I know there are maybe times when welfare of the United States conflicts with what United States, what's good for the United States may not be good for Israel, or maybe the United States has their own interests and they're trying to pressure Israel into doing what we want, or what we say, and then it's really for our interest, not for theirs. But so I do, on the one hand, believe that Israel, no one should dictate to them what they need to do or how they need to defend themselves. But on the other hand, we're also Americans, and can we be Americans and Jews at the same time and think of what's best for the United States, what's best for Israel, what's best for both of them, what's best for not good for either of them. It's kind of hard to balance all of that.
It's really hard to balance all of that. I think you're right, Susan. I think, um, should there is also, of course, this fear that is pretty well grounded that there aren't a lot of superpowers, let's say, in the world that support Israel right now. And what if Israel suddenly no longer had a friend in the United States? And that's a real thing to worry about, except and I could be wrong in this, but I actually don't necessarily worry about either Kamala Harris or President or former President Trump becoming someone who's really not a friend to Israel, broadly speaking. There, I'm sure, would be some policies where I might take issue, whether it would have to do with how a ceasefire is conducted or whether it has to do with what agreements with Iran might exist. But some of those nitty-gritty things, hopefully those can be worked out beyond just the president themselves too, of course. So that's why we talk with our senators, we talk with our representatives, we talk with all sorts of people who govern for us, and we share our opinion. It's important to keep our voice in the political process at all times. Susan, I hope that that's a helpful, if not insufficient, response to your own concerns there. I want to get to a few other folks, but maybe we'll circle back to you if there's more on that. Alan, I see you've got your hand up. I'll pin you too.
Right. I couldn't find the electronic hand. I'm sorry. So I had to resort to the old-fashioned one. Uh,
Sure.
First of all, thank you very much. It's very edifying. Second of all, since we're allowing halacha to be anthropomorphized today, does it vote for the person or the policy?
Hmm. That's a great question, Alan. Um, it's a good philosophical question about a real theoretical. I said we weren't going to talk so much about theoreticals today, but look what just happened. So I would say, look, we unfortunately don't get ballots that ask us, what do you think should happen next in Israel? And we don't get ballots that say too often. I mean, in certain states, you do get questions about abortion on the ballot, right? You don't really get to ask and answer questions about specific policies usually. And even then, there's usually a process of whether it's your state House of Representatives or your state Senate that they have to ratify however the people voted, or maybe your city council has to vote on that. Um, I think ultimately halacha does have to, like a person does, vote for the person whose policies best represent them. Alan, if you're going to ask me next, so which person does halacha vote for? I'm not going to answer that right now, but I judge that everyone can take the opinions that they read and figure out, which candidate lines up most with how you understand it, of course.
Rabbi, you know that I would be probably very reluctant to adopt anybody else's opinion since I have so many of my own, right?
I appreciate that, Alan. It's good to live life with an abundance of opinions. They're very exciting. Um, let's see, any other hands or thoughts from folks? This is the quietest gathering of the Jewish people in years. So I'm going to acknowledge that we're also just a few minutes over time. Thank you so much, Anne, our ASL interpreter, for being with us this evening and creating all of this to be so much more accessible. Of course, accessibility is a big component of who we are at Hebrew Seminary. We have been training our rabbinical students for 32 years now to be able to work with the deaf community, and we've ordained folks who are deaf as well. It's of course, an important component of who we are that we remain accessible to hearing culture, to deaf culture, and that we understand that there's so many perspectives that our world brings. We're a pluralistic institution, which is part of the spirit of tonight's conversation, that there's no single one best answer for some of these questions. But I know that you all have the tools you need to vote, and I'm wishing you a sacred election day next week.